You know, Vint, Ellie, we've been hearing a lot about AI, I mean, among other things. So one of the questions, maybe just to start off the conversation, to put in context, where are we on what we might call the hype curve? In other words, are we at the internet in 1985 to 1990 or 1999, 2000, right before the bubble burst? What's real, what's not? In terms of this AI conversation that we've been having.
So actually, we have to start with an observation. You notice that two of us have three-piece suits on, and this one doesn't. He didn't get the memo. You know, the hype curve and hyperscaler sounds kind of similar. I think we are probably close to falling off the top of the hyperbolic curve. You know, the one where everybody is going crazy about everything, and then there's the valley of death. So we're over the top of that because people are starting to recognize that artificial intelligence doesn't always work the way you would like it to. It's not 100% reliable. You brought up machine learning versus large language models. Again, worth emphasizing that there are different kinds of artificial intelligence, and the machine learning models can be quite reliable because they're based on statistical phenomena that are stable. So the example that I use is the cooling of our data centers. That's a statistical process which is definable and measurable. We taught the machine learning tool to adjust the pumps and the valves to cool the data center with less power required, 40% in our case. So that's an example of a reasonable and stable statistical environment in which you can build a model that's useful and reliable. The large language models are much more complex than that. So I think we're over the top of the hyperbolic curve, but we are on our way down to realizing that we have to work really hard to make this more reliable than it is today. That's where I would set it. Where do you think we are, Ellie?
Well, I would say there are perhaps two different types of hype cycles. There is the hype cycle that I will start with, which is the hype cycle of dystopia. As soon as AI started to be on the public consciousness, which was about 2 years ago, of course it goes back 60, 70 years ago, but there was more in the background. There was a lot of hype there. There was expert systems. There were neural networks that were always going to revolutionize things. And then came AI winter because there was disappointment. And so there'll clearly be disappointments here too. But the dystopia hype cycle was that as soon as it became out there in the public consciousness, there was this whole outburst of hand-wringing. And I thought that AI was kind of almost like a inkblot test for everybody's fears and hopes. Mostly fears. There was inequality, there was bias, there was job displacement, there was privacy, there was national sovereignty. There was the list goes on, and you've heard it all. And it's not that they're incorrect, but they were kind of like perhaps a little bit over the top, not weighing it, not balancing it with the positives. And and that led to this kind of stampede almost of let's do something and let's regulate something and let's try to prevent something. And so that's one hype cycle that hopefully has turned, but I have not quite seen it. I have not quite seen the kind of true counterforces. The counterforce probably would be if AI kind of continues to be actually used and nothing really terrible happens. No nuclear wars, no kind of economic meltdowns because somebody kind of put in the wrong line of code or something like that. Now, the second cycle is the hype cycle is the investment, the Wall Street-y type hype cycle. And clearly kind of the valuations you put into your business plan or into your name, AI, and you add $10 billion in valuations. And that seems to have somewhat slowed down. There are some real companies that make some real products, NVIDIA in particular. They're able to sell their chip for $40,000, their Hopper or whatever it's called. most recent one, and they have other things kind of merging, kind of putting together multiple chips into still larger chips. So they probably are going to make an awful lot of money, and continuously a lot of money. But the question is, have companies actually, in using AI, made a lot of money doing AI? And they're practically, as far as I can tell, no real examples. So I'm sure there will be exceptions, but on the whole, companies have not made money using AI in terms of revenue. Where there is probably much more of a promise is not so much in more revenue, but in lower cost, lowering the cost. And there are some surveys that show that companies kind of can customer service type representation and all kinds of other things. Maybe not quite as glamorous as kind of inventing new drugs or something like that, but kind of cost reductions, that is real and will continue. And that might not be visible in the stock market valuations, because these are not specifically AI companies. These are companies that absorb AI to make their processes somewhat more efficient.
Vint, you want to?
Yeah, I love listening to Ellie because he makes me think. And several things came to my mind immediately as you talked about the dystopic cycle. AI is a killer app. That's what everybody was worried about. It might be literally taken that way. The other thing that I was struck by is that whenever the government or the people who make up the government get worried that there might be something wrong, their first reactions are, we have to regulate something or we have to tax something. Because those are the kinds of things that the folks in the Congress can do. And the last point, though, the one about how do you make money with this stuff, in the gold rushes, the people who make money are not the ones looking for the gold. They're the ones selling the picks and shovels to the people who are looking for the gold. And in many ways, the companies that are supporting access to artificial intelligence are making money out of the access platforms and the basic applications and the foundational models, as opposed to the actual apps that the AI might be enabling. And so that's actually, it's a serious consideration when you look at potential revenue production for supporting all those people who want to invent new things using artificial intelligence and machine learning is a good business.
Yeah, Ellie, go ahead.
I would say one of the reasons why people, and I was wondering, why did people turn so nervous and almost hostile about AI? Which, after all, wouldn't we love to have more intelligence around? I mean, it's hard enough to find it in the natural sphere. And that is partly, I think, in our DNA. Because in our evolutionary DNA, and I'm serious about this, we're kind of, by evolution, have a problem with other species because they were the predators. We had to worry about them. They came after us, and so when we got rid of the predators, we started to invent them. There were the dragons. Okay, when we slayed all the dragons, then we started in literature to come up with all kinds of other stuff. Frankenstein's monster and hell in the film 2001, Space Odyssey, and the Golem of Prague, and all these kind of instances in which we conjured up this kind of like artificial, it's almost like aliens from space, who would kind of somehow take over and kind of use us and kind of treat us in the end like pets, that they kind of like control, where they're running the world and we're just their kind of little playthings.
I'm going to make a prediction. The prediction is that Pepper is not going to get to ask another question in the rest of this hour, because this is going to keep going. Here's the next thing that Ellie just triggered, his DNA thing. I have a similar related DNA theory. You know that we react as human beings to warnings much more readily than anything else. We really, really react. That's the social media, the rapid propagation of misinformation and disinformation, most of which is warnings. So why do we react so strongly to that? Well, it's easy to understand our evolution looking at the gene pool. The Cro-Magnon that noticed a bear and said, gee, that's interesting. I wonder what species the bear is and how many family members it has. They didn't survive to add to the gene pool. It's the guy that said, it's a bear, run. And so our DNA has predisposed us to respond without thinking to warnings, and that's part of the evolution of the human being. Okay, now you can ask.
No, so we just actually create more warnings. But I want to go back to something that Ellie raised, which is the use of machine learning, and you also raised it then in terms of the managing data centers and so on. But there's something very analogous, right? So it took how many years before telecom, the fact that we had telephones showed up in productivity numbers in the economy. For a long time, people talked about the internet, right, as being enabling enterprise, lowering costs, increasing revenue, increasing productivity. But it took decades before it showed up in the productivity numbers. And we're just at the earliest stages of using machine learning and anything coming out of Gen AI in business and enterprise, building solutions, lowering the costs, which we are already seeing. But if telecom and the internet are any guides, it's going to be decades before they actually show up in the productivity numbers, in part because the way the productivity numbers and GDP numbers are compiled don't actually make adjustments for this or incorporate it. So, Ellie,
Well, it depends when your starting date is. If your starting date is 2 years ago, then it will be relatively more rapid. If your starting date is, let's say, Herbert's...
How about 1962, when the AI starts to be researched? That's 60
Right.
years ago.
Yes. Yeah. I would agree with kind of Herbert Simon and Newell and Marvin Minsky and people like that. That if you take that as the starting point, we already are 40 or 50 or 60 years into that cycle, and also it has already penetrated. I mean, Siri and Alexa and all these what are they called? These assistants when you call some e-commerce type provider or whatever, they already exist, and the airlines and Uber, and so we're not at the beginning here quite. Will it penetrate rapidly? I believe so. There's always the tendency to overestimate the short term, underestimate the long term, but eventually, and historically speaking, very rapidly. I mean, for an investor, maybe not rapidly enough, but historically for the human race, a kind of extraordinary, rapid transformations, and that is something we should be ready about. What kind of a society will we have in a few years if, statistically speaking, the average IQ assisted by these machines will be 120 instead of 100 now? Where will we be if everybody with these tools will be in some ways empowered to be smarter?
I'm just thinking about the idea that people are smart. Sometimes that doesn't always work out. This rant about wanting to identify that content was produced by an artificial intelligence and that we should somehow label that and warn everybody.
In the name of transparency.
What about the people who produce bad content deliberately and have nothing to do with artificial intelligence or machine learning? I mean, I think the real issue is understanding whether the content is valid or not. And it just doesn't make any sense to me to specially label something as produced by an artificial intelligence.
The question's the following.
Wait a minute, actually, I'm sorry to interrupt, but now that I think about it, if we're going to start labeling things, we can label the things produced by AI as produced by artificial intelligence, and then the things produced by human beings as produced by an artificial idiot.
Artificial lack of intelligence.
Egalitarian. Anyway, you were saying.
Oh no. Again, the analogy question is there are rules that say you may not impersonate a lawyer, right? You can't pretend you're a lawyer and give legal advice. And if you do that, there are penalties. You cannot impersonate.
The guys on TV, they wear the little white coats
Yeah,
and
but
they
they're
say,
not.
"Hi, I'm an actor."
Yeah,
I'm
but
not really a
the
doctor."
patients are artificially intelligent. They're artificial patients. The same thing with or clients. The same thing with doctors. And the question is, for transparency labeling, should there be a limitation or a label saying if you have getting legal advice from a machine? I mean, should that be identified as coming from, in other words, those are the kinds of transparencies.
I understand the line of reasoning that you're suggesting. I'm going to suggest a slight variation on that. The real question is the quality of the advice and how risky is it to accept that advice. And in that case, I think you're right. If you are using an AI system to do medical diagnosis, offer financial advice or legal advice, being warned ahead of time that it might be risky, or the parties that are offering that service ought to be required to demonstrate that they have taken steps to protect the interests of the party receiving that advice. To think about the very successful efforts right now to use AI systems to detect cancer or other kinds of diseases. They work better statistically than the doctors do individually.
Yeah, and there's a mediation. So if I'm a radiologist and I'm using an AI tool to evaluate an X-ray, right, that actually has built a huge database, and I'm effectively, using what the database has learned, which has come from radiologists that have done, exams, thousands of them, and then that's what I'm using as a radiologist to make a diagnosis, and now I talk to the patient. As far as the patient knows, I mean, it's irrelevant whether the radiologist was on his own. Actually, it's better that he was using an AI tool to help with the diagnosis.
Unless, Ellie, I hope you jump in here.
Yes.
The analytic tools that you were suggesting, like the radiology analysis, if the data that was used to train that wasn't trained with a broad enough set of samples, so we get bias built in, you can miss a diagnosis that was important. Somehow we have to fit that in, don't we?
Yeah, thank you. This is good. But I would say, kind of instead of disclosure requirements, there has to be a responsibility. A human has to be at the end of the chain, sign off as being responsible for what went into that sausage. It could be the lawyer could have been actually totally reliant on a paralegal. The paralegal could have been reliant on some summer intern. And of course, there are databases that they're using too. So I don't see what, in books, of course, that could lead or mislead you. I think that kind of having to disclose every ingredient that goes into advice or conclusion is perhaps excessive. Responsibility for a human at the end of that chain has to be there, and then that human has to make sure. There was the example of this hapless lawyer somewhere in New York who was kind of like having AI kind of do these cases, and it turns out these cases were fictitious and the quotes were made up. I mean, that's his problem, and now he's disbarred, and no lawyer will every lawyer in the future will be very careful in checking what that kind of AI has done.
So two things come out of what you just said, for me anyway. One of them is transparency,
yes,
and the other one is accountability.
Yeah.
And it feels like those are really important mechanisms that we want to introduce, independent of AI.
Yes.
Which is the point you're making.
Yes.
So this goes to the question of, how to avoid pitfalls. We've already gotten into that conversation. What's enough in terms of, let's call them guardrails instead of regulation? What's too much? How do we know what's too much, right? At what point does the line get crossed? Because, we've talked in other contexts through the last day and a half, but even before that, the difference, and Ellie, you've talked about this as well, the difference between ex ante regulation and ex post, right? And how do you think about that when it comes to AI and what's needed at what point in time to address what kinds of questions?
Well, would you agree that prevention is important? it's worth a pound of cure, if I remember the adage right, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. So if we could do things and take actions that protect us from risk ahead of time by some regulatory framework, that sounds attractive to me. On the other hand, we might not be regulating the right thing. And in particular, I think it's not likely that we can figure out in today's world exactly how to literally regulate the machine learning models that are being built. But we can take advantage of what Ellie said about transparency. For example, what information was used to train the model. Making that kind of information available at least gives you a basis for assessing whether or not the advice coming out of the model has, utility and reason.
So you don't think some of the proposals, for example, coming from Europe, about making the models, the operating systems for the models available for inspection by government? I mean, this is.
Well, I find that kind of laughable because I don't think anybody can figure out, not even the existing experts, government or otherwise, by looking at the model, whether or not that tells you very much. I don't think we understand this stuff well enough yet for that to work, which is why I much prefer asking for some kind of assurance that high-risk applications are being offered, but only in the presence of steps taken to protect the safety of the consumer of what's coming out of those AI applications. So I think this should be risk mitigation, should be our focus of attention, not trying to regulate the actual details of the models themselves.
Ellie?
What do you think, Ellie?
Vint is always a font of wisdom, so let me kind of add to that, which is, first, AI is such a broad topic, and so instead of thinking about it as a technology, I think it's more useful to think of actual applications and say, in the banking field, there's this problem, in the pornography field, there's that problem, and deal with it kind of sector by sector. And if we do that, we discover that in almost every case, there is already a law on the books. I mean, you cannot just do child pornography because there's a law against it. So you don't have to write it into an AI-type legislation in anticipation that somehow people will stop meeting each other and will just kind of go online for their fun. And then the regulation. I was for several years a state regulator, and so I kind of a commissioner, and so I know the problems with that, which is you're trying to do more things and you try to balance and you squeeze in other stuff. And in regulation of AI, inevitably you will get into all kinds of discussions and considerations of national sovereignty, of national competitiveness, industrial policy. There will be political authoritarian type tendencies to kind of control content. There will be moral issues. A whole hodgepodge of things that will be thrown into these regulations. And I also noticed that nobody calls this regulations anymore. They call it, the euphemism now is guardrails. So guardrails is the model. And in a practical sense, I would argue, because there are multiple ways of doing this, liability rules and self-regulation and so on, but ultimately, and think about that, the issues with AI might be so rapid and so novel, and because there will be attacks, AI will be used in an aggressive way, in an offensive way, in both senses of the word, that there will be, in a way that the only way to control AI is by AI, which is kind of like separate AI that will try to make sure that the AI kind of does not go off the rails, and that restores human controls, because the handover from a off the rails AI to humans, somebody has to do that, and often might have to do this in kind of extraordinarily quickly before things kind of go really kaput. And so that must be in some form of AI, that because right now, let's say if you have an airplane and there's there's a autopilot, and then there are two pilots there, and they kind of most of the time sit there and are bored. But eventually, in certain situations, you must have the actual pilots take over really rapidly, and that turnover period, the change of control, that's really the kind of the key element.
Yeah, actually, we have some data. As you know, Google has this Waymo subsidiary, and we build and operate self-driving cars. And we tried to take the steering wheel and the brakes and all of this stuff out of the car. And we weren't allowed to do that in California. But the reason that we were compelled to go down that path is that we discovered that if someone was sitting in what is supposed to be a self-driving car, but we stick them in the driver's seat and we say, you know, it won't always work 100% of the time. You should be prepared to take over. We discovered that it takes people 60 seconds to figure out what the hell is going on when the car says, I don't know what to do. And so there wasn't enough time for you to recover from whatever the hell was about to happen. So putting you in a place where you thought you were in control was a mistake. Eventually, we may get to the point where we can actually trust these cars to do that. I've been on self-driving car expeditions, and it's slightly unnerving when it takes off and there's nobody in the pilot's seat. But I'm impressed by how well these things work, except that the population local to where these cars are operating hate them, and the reason they hate them is that the cars drive like an 80-year-old. That would be me. They're very cautious. And they don't like that because they're impatient. Your pilot thing made me think of another story about what airplanes are going to be like in the next 5 years. There will be a pilot and a dog in the cockpit.
Uh-huh.
And you've heard the story. You know, the pilot is there to feed the dog, and the dog is there to keep the pilot from touching anything.
Yes. Right.
So earlier on, you referred to GDP, and I'm sorry, I'm pulling something back from an earlier conversation, but it dawned on me that a lot of what we do when we talk about regulation is we measure something in order to figure out how to regulate it. And I've become increasingly uncomfortable with GDP as a measure of anything because it's an additive thing and it doesn't take into account all the negative results like pollution and harmful effects. We should have negative elements in the GDP to take into account the bad stuff that our businesses and industries cause, in addition to whatever positive thing they do. But I guess the economists are telling us we can't do that.
Well, but we have an economist here.
So, Ellie, can we do some negative elements in the GDP to make it more realistic? They weren't coming for this conversation, but
I think that that's really complicated because I mean, how would you even define what negative is? I mean, it's a bit like the recent proposals about capital gains tax, or unrealized capital gains.
I hate that idea.
Unrealized capital gains, but then you have to also recognize unrealized capital losses, and that's kind of a very tricky thing. So I don't think that's.
But in terms of pros, if I could just go back, in terms of Vince talking about pros and cons, one of the things that you've looked at is the impact of AI on, for example, the media industries. Yes. So there are pros and cons. So maybe you can just talk a little bit about that work, right?
All right. Different industries will be affected in different ways. And so healthcare, for example, will be impacted enormously and mostly positively, whether it comes to the management of care and the identification of symptoms and of public health issues and treatment and new drugs and all kinds of stuff, not to mention the paperwork. But another kind of industry that will be enormously impacted will be media. And why is that, particularly video? And why is that? Because almost every step of media, video media, is going to be affected, whether it's in the just in the marketing, in the management of the production, but also in the conceptualizing of a script, of an idea, or even the writing of the first draft of an idea, or the analysis of what works in the past and what might work, what kind of storylines, what kind of actors. Or speaking of actors, kind of substituting actors by lifelike avatars, and in particular, not kind of the main characters. That's kind of a bit harder to do, but the secondary characters and people in the background. So in the production sector. So, this is still all in the notion, and also real-time rendering, where you can actually kind of follow the storyline and change it. This is still more in the context of an existing type style of media, just produced in a more effective, efficient way and distributed more and monetized better and so on. But I think that there's also technologies and techniques, content engineering, that gives us new tools, such as immersion and interactivity and participation and branching storylines. And they have all had their hoopla in certain kind of niche markets of where people are doing and talking about this. But in reality, they don't really exist. No one here, I assume, other than perhaps on some trade show demonstration, has actually seen and enjoyed in the comfort of their homes any of this stuff. And the reason is, and a metaverse, I should have mentioned, metaverse, how has that been going? Bob?
Well, actually, it's going quite well.
But as an entertainment medium, not as a marketing type operation.
So if you think about part of that in terms of the metaverse, the devices, the Quest 3s and so on, a lot of it's being used for individual work and enterprise work and so on. But one of the industries, and you've looked at it, the gaming industry, right, in terms of revenue, actually is one of the largest entertainment industries, but that people don't think of it that way, right?
Well,
and it's global, and the devices allow, right, that and enable that in terms of those uses. But we can talk about also some of the mixed reality, not just the headsets with the gaming, with the entertainment, but some of the most powerful future applications that are no longer future are things that are being done with the mixed reality and the augmented reality Ray-Ban Metas, where you have integrating AI into the glasses so that you can be speaking in English, I can hear it in French, and so on. So it's actually going quite well.
Well, actually, what Bob is referring to, and I totally agree, is that in a way, for the future media, the pace setter are games in terms of technique and style and technology. That they're the pace setters of this to a medium system in which is much more experiential rather than kind of lean back but more participatory. And that doesn't mean that people are continuously participating and experiencing, because people come back from work and they just want to lean back. But it will also be there, and it will be in some ways at the leading edge of not only technology but culture, that the young filmmakers will make things like that. But coming to the AI, these elements, these technology elements that content engineering has provided are still too uncomfortable and difficult for individuals to do. And AI can weave them together and control them in ways that it's just too hard. So instead of people, there are these branching storylines. Example, you asked kind of, should there be a happy ending? Should there be a sad ending? Should they get together? Should they break up? And you get kind of like billions of different ways in which the same story could be told. Instead, the AI could do that for you, because they know who you are, they know what your preferences are, they kind of have experience with you, they know what you liked in the past. And so AI could actually be the element that puts together these tools, these building blocks that could create a new video system in the future that is much more immersive and individualized and participatory and experiential.
Actually, I'm glad that you brought that up, Because a lot of people make the express the view that artificial intelligence can't do anything new, that it's just drawing on existing stuff that it ingested and then it's regurgitating. And I would argue, especially listening to what Ellie had to say, that new combinations are, in fact, potentially very novel. And the possibility that an artificial intelligence would help you produce something which has never been produced in that combination before feels kind of creative to me. I don't know if you've tried interacting with chatbots, but I remember asking one to write me a haiku about a rose in the Shakespearean style. And it produced what I thought was a fairly credible output of 17 syllables, and picking up some Middle English kinds of elements. So I think we should give some credit to combinations here. It also, something else occurred to me. I love words and I love word puns. And so you were mentioning pros and cons. And I was thinking that you were spelling it differently than I thought. PROSED,
Yes,
which is what comes out of a lot of bots. And cons, well, they're using this to con people by creating all kinds of stuff. So now we have a new meaning for pros and cons.
Speaking of the of combinations, here's a pencil. And there was, in fact, a case, I think it may have gone all the way to the Supreme Court. There used to be pencils and there were erasers. And at some point in the 19th century, somebody put an eraser on top of a pencil. And it hadn't been done before. So he was first denied a patent. And he said, well, pencils have been around forever and erasers have been around forever. Yes, but together, that's a new combination. And as far as I know, he won the case.
Well, I hope that we get to take advantage of the potential richness of AI combinations. I'm a big wine fan, and I can tell you there are a hell of a lot of variables associated with making a good bottle of wine. So maybe we'll get an AI enologist out of all of this. That would be cool.
But one of the questions, do we truly want perfection? I mean, would you actually watch a basketball game in which 5 robots play against another 5 robots and every shot gets in? Would this be interesting to watch?
That does sound kind of boring, I have to admit. Yeah. So we'll have to create artificial mistakes to go along with that.
That's right.
As if we humans don't make enough of them on our own as it is. In fact, just to bring this back to internet for just 1 second, most of the big disasters that happen in the internet environment have nothing to do with malevolent intent. What is it? Do not attribute to malevolent intent that which can be attributed to stupidity.
That's right.
We make dumb mistakes in configurations and things like that, and that often is what causes the net to go down. Look at the thing with CrowdStrike, for example. Wow, what a cascade failure that was, and that was not deliberate. That was a dumbass mistake.
Yeah. And can AI prevent that?
Oh boy, is that ever a loaded question. I don't know.
In terms of network, in terms of updating, exactly.
That sounds like a really credible challenge to the research community. Can you train an AI to recognize mistakes that have been made? And by the way, all this crap about regulating AI and everything else, why the hell aren't we talking about regulating software in general? It's not AI that's your problem. It's software that's your problem.
Yeah, but do you think regulating software in general is a good idea?
It's going to be impossible.
Oh.
But the thing is, if we're, the hyperbole, to borrow your early opening remarks about regulation, if just focused on AI feels like we're not recognizing what our real risk is. When I get into the elevators in this hotel, you poke a little button, it says get in the elevator, and you get in, there's no control. There's somebody's software is controlling that. And I've been in the software game for a long time. I get nervous about other people's software. So, you might be worried about AI. I'm worried about everything else.
If you're worried about prose in your spelling, there's, according to a trade association, so let's hope the numbers are correct, novels get written now kind of a lot by AI. In the young entertainment, young adult entertainment, young adult prose novels, whatever the category is called, they claim that in the last several years, 30 novels were actually, that made the top 10 were actually written by AI. Just think about that. And presumably young adults, they perhaps don't quite have the ability to discern what's AI written and what's human written, to the point that there was such productivity created that that Amazon restricted any single author from posting more than 3 novels a day.
Wow.
So,
Well, there's a statistic that I hadn't heard before.
So a lot of the conversation, especially yesterday, when Ambassador Fick was here, it was the role of government. And he was very clear that, the policy of U.S. government, and we talked about it on the panel earlier this morning, was to promote innovation, a global internet, global data, an open internet. And I guess a question is, as we're hearing some of the dystopian, as Ellie put it earlier, claims and concerns, what is the, and questions about development, bringing the applications and benefits to everybody, right? Some of the discussion in the last panel. What's the appropriate role of government, and not just regulation, but a role of government as a facilitator, as a convener, as a funder, as a regulator, or none of the above? I mean, how do you measure that? And meshing that with where the vast majority of innovation comes from, which is the private sector, academic institutions, the technology innovators. And how do we get that balance? Because then, as you said, if a problem arises, the first thing that, I'm gonna say government, politicians want to do is to jump in and say, I'm gonna solve your problem, and they impose something, a regulation. I mean, the old joke about medieval tax collectors, right? They would visit every farm because, there was a tax on livestock. And if the pig was sleeping, they would kick it to see if it moved. And if it moved, they would tax it. And that's true. So, the question is, how do you balance the role of government in they have multiple levers and dials to turn up and down, versus the innovation, and where do we want to be and how fast do we want to get there, as opposed to wanting to slow it down? Because you said, well, maybe what we have to do is, if we have regulation that is protective, that may be okay to protect us from bad things. The question is, are regulations to protect us from bad things? How do you prevent those regulations from preventing new cool things, innovation?
So yesterday I made the observation that some of these questions are like the physics question that says, explain the universe in 25 words or less and give 3 examples, right? That's what this question is like. What I immediately think of when you ask that question is Rousseau and the social contract. And I think about government as an enabler, or what I wish government could be, which is an enabler of a society that we want to live in. It seems to me that should be the primary focus and objective of government, is to be an enabler of the society that we want to live in. And that does include our willingness to give up some capacity in exchange for a safe environment. So I'm willing to accept the idea that my freedom of action is constrained, 1 centimeter from your nose. And if I punch you in the nose, then I am violating the social contract that we all thought we agreed to, which is the government says there are rules. If you violate the rules, there'll be consequences. So I think if we could look at it that way, government can be a very powerful enabler of the outcomes that we might be looking for from this technology. Some of the outcome is to be safe from bad use or inappropriate use of the technology, or even the technology that itself simply fails. It's not because somebody is deliberately trying to do harm with it, it just doesn't work the way we expect it to. Government might be saying, you shouldn't be putting that kind of technology out and making it accessible unless you have a strong verification or validation or indication that you have protected people from harm. Think about the software that goes into a surgical system, like what is it, the Da Vinci robot system from Intuitive, what's it, ISRG. Anyway, I think that software gets extreme scrutiny to make sure that the robot doesn't itself initiate some action that would be harmful. So it feels like the government ought to be in a position to do something very constructive to help us enjoy the benefits of all these powerful tools while shielding us from their potential harmful effects.
Ellie, as a former regulator?
I agree with Vint. I always agree with Vint. How could one not agree with such a reasonable position? But I would say, let's be more specific. I think there are some risks that governments should very clearly be in charge of. For example, issues of nuclear war and stuff like that. That should be intergovernmentally agreed. There should be agreements, just like there's the kind of the telephone line to the Kremlin or whatever. Those things should be kind of should remain under governmental control so that nothing really terrible happens there. When it comes to other things, I would say it kind of when something bad happens, we'll deal with it. So if somebody punches you in the nose, then there should be some consequences, or laws and rules and regulations and guardrails should be imposed. But just because we say there might be somebody out there, there could be somebody who will punch somebody in the nose in the future, who knows, to have already anticipatory regulations and controls over that, I think kind of we might want to wait until actually something happens.
So this is classical US versus EU. In the EU, something bad might happen, we should regulate.
Yes.
In the US, something bad has happened, we should regulate.
Yeah, exactly right. Now, now what was my train of thought?
Sorry.
Go ahead.
So let me just picking up on what Vince said more generally, because it went to the earlier conversation in the previous panel about innovation, right? Way oversimplifying, common law,
Yes.
Is that which is not prohibited is permitted, whereas in continental law, that which is not explicitly permitted is prohibited. And so that is fun on the internet, age. I mean, we talked a lot about permissionless innovation.
Yes.
And the question is, how do we think about that in a responsible way, permissionless innovation in AI and these new sets of applications?
I now kind of remember because you said the word common law, which is that in some ways a system, this might actually be a real area for common law approach, which is courts and agencies and incrementally and around the world, they kind of identify problems and then they deal with it and everybody learns from it, rather than kind of anticipating, which is totally impossible, anticipating any problem well in advance. And so common law principles of kind of identifying problems. Now the problem with common law system is that it's slow moving. And so maybe one thing that one should think about would be just like there are patent courts, that there should be specialized AI type courts of people who kind of know their stuff and kind of specialize, who operate under a time schedule that makes more sense for that industry, which is so rapidly moving. They can't wait for 2.5 years for a decision to be made.
There has been an expression that I have heard that the 9/11 disaster in the US was a failure of imagination. I think I may even have heard that phrase yesterday, which speaks to anticipatory aspects of all this. And so I think we need to find a medium here, because the technologists who offer these new technologies may not have thought their way through what the side effects might be, what the consequences might be. And although I admit I didn't have any sense of all the consequences of the internet either, I was just focused on trying to make the damn thing work. I do think that this question, what could possibly go wrong, is a good question to ask, especially about powerful technologies whose evolution is rapid and, in today's world, global.
Yeah, and so a question then for you, because you've raised it in the past, one of the things that you did not think about back then was security. If you had thought about security at the time to design in, at the beginning, would that have made a difference? In other words,
It would have prevented us from getting the internet to work.
Right.
And I want to make a distinction
Okay.
between security and safety here, as long as
Okay,
we're
well,
having this conversation. But just, this is my mea culpa justification. In 1976, I came to Washington to run the internet program. And in that year, Marty Hellman and Whit Diffie wrote their paper on new directions in cryptography, which eventually led to public key crypto. I'm leaving out the fact that the GCHQ in the UK had invented this idea in 1974, but they kept it secret because they didn't want anybody to know about how that would work. And of course, they were pretty dismayed when Whit and Marty published their paper 2 years later. So I knew about public key crypto when I came here, and the internet was just at the cusp of standardization of the TCP/IP protocols. And at that point, I wanted to get this built so we could see if it would actually work. And I thought about introducing a bunch of crypto of that kind. I had already worked with NSA the year before on implementing conventional cryptography mechanisms. We'd had to invent packet crypto, because the previous crypto was continuous cryptography. Packet crypto meant the stuff could come out of order. You had to decrypt it out of order. That was not normal for crypto technology at the time. We figured out how to do that. But we weren't using public key crypto for key distribution. We were using the conventional ways, which didn't scale at all. All I could think of was that introducing some of those mechanisms, including public key crypto, at that time would have been a terrible mistake, because who would we be forcing to do good key management practices? A bunch of graduate students, because those are the only people who were using and building the network. They're the last people in the world you would expect to do a good job of key management. And if I've insulted some graduate student in the room, it was deliberate. So we decided not to do that, because I knew we could put that in. I knew it could be retrofitted in, and we have retrofitted it. You all see this all the time with HTTPS and public key crypto mechanisms and the like. So no, I think it would have inhibited our ability to figure out if this was going to work.
what about safety?
No, safety and security are not the same.
No, I know that, yeah.
And but it's terribly, I know you know that, but there are a lot of people who conflate those two, and they think that a highly secure system means it's safe. Not true.
No.
Imagine that you've got an email system, and it does end-to-end cryptography, and you even encrypt the message gets to you, you decrypt the message, and guess what it has in it? Malware. And it's hidden from everybody on the way from source to destination. So safety is not the same thing, and we have to make that distinction, and we have to care about that, because just because something is secure doesn't make it safe.
So how do you apply that to what we've been talking about in terms of AI?
So that's a really interesting question. How do we know whether something is safe? Well, we might take a page from the medical world and look at what the FDA says to us about approving drugs for use. We first show they have they're effective, and then we show that they don't have bad side effects, or whatever side effects are diminished relative to the benefits you get from that drug. So I wonder if we can't think our way through and learn enough about these new technologies to actually say something about efficacy and safety. At the moment, I don't think we know enough to make judgments about that. But maybe that's why we should be using these things more and more, as opposed to suppressing them in order to find out what their functionality is in order to figure out what we should be doing to make them safer. What do you think, Ellie?
Well, the problem with the FDA analogy is that the FDA takes often years and years, and similarly the FAA with aircraft, long testing, expensive testing, which makes it more expensive for newcomers to come in. They don't know what they have to do. They cannot game the system in the same way. And then the rapidity of change in AI is such that if you put in a year or two and opponents, rivals can come in and intervene and try to stop you, so you have some real problems. But let's assume that some countries will do it and some other countries will not do it. And so what's the consequence? And here too, I think that in some ways, AI might be a problem to solve the AI problem, which is that multiple countries, they will have different rules on applications. EU will have one way, and the United States, as you said, have another way, in Brazil and so on. They will have their own ways. And so how is a company to comply with all these different rules? And comply they must. So I think that's kind of one of the Elon Musk problems in Brazil right now, which is, does he comply with the national laws, however misguided they might be, of Brazil, or is he kind of on his own? That's kind of the part of the controversy. But where I can come in is since there are 250 countries or whatever, each one of them will have their own rules and regulations for lots of things, in a way to tailor the product to the particular markets or the particular industries, because otherwise there'll be a race to the bottom and the most restrictive regulation will govern for the entire world, which is basically what the EU strategy has been right now.
Okay, so first of all, the FDA is trying to figure out whether something is safe or not. And as you say, it takes a long time and it's expensive and it's a long drawn-out process. If what we're trying to understand is what could go wrong, which is what the FDA is trying to answer, another way to do that is to let AI run rampant. We'll find out all the various ways in which it could go wrong, and we'll do it very, very quickly. The question then will be, how much damage do we suffer as a result of that discovery? Plainly, those two endpoints are not desirable, so we want to figure out what goes in between. I think your idea or your question, can AI help us deal with problems of AI, might turn out to be a really interesting thing to follow. In any case, what we might argue is that if we can identify risk in the application of these technologies, then we should ask the parties who are offering them to show cause how they have mitigated risk, which is what FDA is trying to do, and it's what we would like to do with these technologies.
So place the burden of proof on them.
Or at least to show that they have taken reasonable steps to protect the safety and reduce the risk of the use of the tools.
Where they have some liability for consequences, unless they have kind of met certain reasonable criteria of reasonable behavior, which is, for example, state-of-the-art or kind of best practices, testing, stress testing, and otherwise. And if they cannot show that they've done that and just kind of dumped a product on the market without kind of...
So build in accountability.
Yes.
Yeah. So we're coming up at the very end. Is there anything that you'd like to close with? And if not, that's okay.
Sure. Well, I used to say, there's an internet in your future, resistance is futile. I think there's an AI in your future, resistance is futile.
I think AI will be seen as one of them, if not the most fundamental change in the history of humanity. It'll just take a while. But kind of the notion, kind of what differentiates us from apes and from bears, the example is that we think and we are smart, or we try to be, and we absorb knowledge and create knowledge, and here is a tool, just like transportation, trains, automobiles, planes, extended the range of our physical presence, will AI extend enormously the range of our intellectual presence. We still think of AI as something that some companies do and we kind of buy their services. But if we think of AI as a tool, a personal tool of strengthening our capabilities, where it becomes our advisor, our financial advisor, our doctor, our matchmaker, our information screener. There's so many things that AI can do for us personally if we control it rather than, let's say, Meta controls it. And that means that AI will prove to be not a limiting and controlling technology which people fear, but it will actually be an empowering technology that makes us as humans more smarter, better informed, more able to cope with issues that confront us. And so I think of this as an extraordinary opportunity, but it will take time.
Thank you. Thank you very much. This has been really interesting. If you could help me thank them.